how is this the way that we're approaching species conservation? The thing with ecology and biodiversity is there's thousands of metrics and it's very local. One of the more interesting things that people don't realize about biodiversity net gain is that the main voices were actually from the development sector itself. I'm also a big fan of finding other levers and ways that we can create change, because it's all about the story and creating something that has meaning and isn't just another something that you just buy and throw away. Whether it's the bird song that they hear when they're out in the fields, or it's a story from their childhood.
That is Rob Wreglesworth, Associate Ecologist and Innovation Lead at the Environment Bank and co-founder of No Longer Known in the UK. Rob is passionate about conservation and started his career as an environmental consultant before moving into the world of tech startups. As part of the Environment Bank, he is pioneering new approaches to conservation finance in the UK by developing a national network of long-term landscape-scale habitat restoration projects. At the same time, he is changing the communication around biodiversity through podcasting and targeting scarcity culture in consumer markets. My name is Peter Marcus Bach, and this is the Grand Challenges Podcast, a show about inspiring individuals who are stepping up to tackle the global challenges that our world is facing in their own unique ways. We reflect on the many out-of-the-box ways our guests have navigated the complexity and intricacies of the environment at the cutting edges of science, engineering, technology, and design. On today's show, Rob and I engage in a wide-ranging conversation around biodiversity and conservation, looking into building financial incentives through biodiversity net gain and nature credits, and how t-shirts can potentially build and motivate conscious efforts of protection in the general public. We dive deep into Rob's passion for nature and how he has transformed his variety of skills into making real-world impact. Detailed information is provided in the show notes over at petermbach.com/podcast. Thank you for joining us today, and please enjoy the show. Rob, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Peter. Great to be here. Thanks.
When you reached out to me, I thought, this is a very interesting topic with a very interesting message. And not to get ahead of myself, but it's great to have another guest from the UK. This year, we're really going into the UK, which is great because there's a lot of good stuff happening there.
Yeah, it's been it's a pleasure to be on, and really love what you're doing with the podcast. I'm sure we'll get into lots of different topics around that and everything else. But yeah, when I came across you, I was like, this guy's on my wavelength. So I'm really excited to talk to you today, Peter, about various different things.
I'm very glad to hear that. And you yourself love good equipment. We seem to have the same taste in microphones. Okay, I'm using a different mic now for this recording, but I think you have a Shure SM7B.
Yeah. In a previous life, I used to have a music blog, which is not really that linked to what I do for my career or what I do in my day job. But so at one point, about 10 years ago, I decided I needed to make some money outside of my job and start a side hustle, and was always interested in music and music equipment, and just start at the time blogging was a big thing, and particularly like SEO based blogging, which was just answering really basic questions that people would have, like, what is the best microphone for this specific situation? Or what's the difference between a Shure SM7B and a Shure SM58 or something really, really technical like that? But finding these questions that no one had done a blog post on the internet and answering them, and then using that to get traffic to the website and making money through either affiliates or through ads and stuff like that. So it was a fun project, and I learned a lot through doing it. But yeah, we were just joking before we started recording that through that, and just through being a bit of an audiophile in general and doing bits and bobs of podcasting myself, one day I just turned around and was surrounded by cables, and now it's a constant challenge to make sure that I'm not knocking over my glass of water or tripping over a cable from a microphone in my
did with my glass.
Yeah, exactly. So my wife always makes fun of me when there'll be another Amazon delivery or something, and she'll just go, is it another cable? And I'll have to kind of look sheepishly away and say, yeah, probably is another cable. But I'm trying to rein that in now, and actually I'm actively trying to part with some of these pieces of equipment that I've gathered over the years. You'll notice I've got a background on, but if you could see behind me, I've got various guitars and synthesizers and stuff still in my room. So they are gathering dust a bit, unfortunately, which is a shame. But I don't think I'm going to be able to part with all my music equipment. That part of my life is still, it's still there. And maybe one day I'll get a bit more time and start to do some more music recording. But
yeah, no, indeed. I mean, music has also been a big part of my life. Similar wavelength, as you said. I also got interested in music production, maybe not as passionate as you, but I definitely also bought a few things. And yeah, I mean, I think at the moment it's copious amounts of books. My wife is starting to complain that maybe there are too many books and I'm not reading them. But no, I do understand the tech part of it, ordering a new synthesizer or like a audio interface or a new microphone. In fact, I went crazy about the microphones in the early days when the ideas of this podcast started, and I was doing interviews with stakeholders across Australia. And yeah, I was always looking for good microphones and good recording equipment, which I use now for the podcast. So I guess it's finding a new lease on life.
That's it. So I'm using one of my microphones today. So I'm glad it's still getting another lease of life, doing something like this, doing something a little bit different, which is great.
And a very good one at that. So a few things you've mentioned already. Podcast. You went into music, doing it as more of a side gig, learning a lot about, SEO traffic, web, things like that we all did in the day. I think it was the early 2000s or 2010s.
Yeah.
And everyone was crazy. I had a travel blog myself, which I actually revisited. At least I revisited the images because the blog itself doesn't exist anymore.
Wow.
But yeah, many hats. And I guess you would describe yourself as an ecologist and environmental scientist.
Yeah, so I studied environmental science. I think when I was at school, I know many people have had this same experience, that when I finished school, I thought, right, well, I'm going to do a university. And I assumed at that point that you basically picked one of the school subjects that you did, and then you went on and did that at university, unless you went on to do something like medicine or veterinary, which were well known. And then I was actually just chatting to someone and talking about maybe doing geography, because that was what I was quite good at school. And I always got my best grades were in geography.
Nice.
And someone mentioned, well, the environment is becoming quite a big topic at the moment. So this would be like 2008, 2009. And that's a sphere of geography, but actually you could go a bit more specific and maybe look at environmental science. So that hadn't occurred to me at all. And it was at that moment where I started to think, actually, that is an area. I was focusing mainly on what I was good at academically, but maybe I should focus a little bit on what I'm passionate about as well, or what I found interest in. And so I ended up going on to study environmental science at university and really loved it, but actually felt like I almost left at the end quite depressed, really. So it was mainly like 3 or 4 years of learning about the problems in great detail, whether it was climate change or other issues, deforestation. I did a mix of ecology, biology modules and geography modules. So learning about Earth system stuff around climate change, but also learning about the ecology issues that were becoming more and more prevalent. And yeah, left after 4 years thinking, right, okay, so there's all these problems and we didn't really look that much into solutions, or I can't really remember doing many modules where we looked at solutions. It was looking at the science and then looking at through that the problems and the issues. And I actually did my master's in Iceland, where I looked at glacier retreat and
yes, another problem.
Yeah, another big problem. And again, another one that really brought it home. So I went to do my 4th year fieldwork in Iceland on a glacier in the south of Iceland. And I took a textbook with me and it had some photos of what the glacier looked like it was probably only about 10, 20 years before that. And I had to double take, because where I was stood, there was a huge lake and there used to be a glacier there. And yeah, it was one of those where, again, seeing these changes it quite starkly in reality really brought it home to me. So yeah, left university feeling a little bit kind of disillusioned and wanting to find some solutions. So yeah, that eventually led me on to trying to figure out what to do with my career from there.
I guess it's something that I've also noticed. We seem to teach a lot of the problems, and we've made reference to this back in episode 42. I had a discussion with Mashal Yastani, and oftentimes it's about defining the problem and defining it well. And once you can do that, then I think the solution itself will come naturally, or at least it's much easier to find potential solutions for it. Because I think oftentimes, we spend a lot less time thinking about the problem and going immediately to the solutions. But I think if you can fully understand it, which probably justifies why they teach a lot of problems in university studies, I think you'll be much better prepared to then tackle or find targeted solutions.
Yeah. And the thing for me was it was the science. We learned about the problems that were occurring from a scientific perspective, but often a lot of the issues, as I've come on to discover throughout my career and as I've got a bit older, they're more social problems, or they're a lot more complicated than just let's fix this one thing. So yeah, after I graduated, I was like, right, how do I start tackling some of these problems? And thought, I'll become an environmental consultant and start having an impact there, and going in, and it was specifically in the UK in the development sector. So housing development and infrastructure development, new roads, where I knew they were having an impact. And I thought, going in as an environmental consultant, I could start to change the behavior of people and start having a big impact. And that's actually where I transitioned into doing more ecology work, because I always had a passion for nature, and thought throughout my whole childhood and throughout before university and through university that you couldn't get a job getting paid to do anything around nature. It was just the realm of the volunteers, something you would do as a hobby, something you would do on the side. So I was already involved in a few volunteer groups and stuff like that, and it was purely a hobby. And when I found out you could get paid to do surveys for different protected species and stuff, I quickly moved into that. But found very quickly that perhaps having an impact as a consultant is limited, and really you're acting as a bit of a last line of defense. And yeah, it was, unsurprisingly now, looking back on it and reflecting on it, it was a little naive to think that I could have a big impact there. But, you know, when you do leave university and you've heard about all these problems, you think, right, I'm ready to change the world. How hard can it be? Turns out it's a little bit trickier.
Yeah. It reminds me of a PhD comic, because many PhDs go into that thinking they'll change the world. And this comic, and we referred to it previously as well, the first panel is like, you know, world, here I come, I'm going to change it. And then you see this graph that sort of shows how much impact you can make. And by the end of it, the last panel, it's like, happy hour, here I come. So yeah, I can understand the frustration, but also the trend. I guess we would think of it as starting out as a voluntary thing to think about nature, because many people are more interested in the economics of it. But actually, that's now, as we've seen in previous episodes, that's now becoming a big issue, where the finances and nature are very heavily intertwined, because the dependence on nature for productivity is huge, not just for goods and services, but also just for our well-being.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's something that we've taken for granted, and it's such a public good that there's a lot of unlearning to do. And it surprises me now when I've moved into my new role, where I'm working with businesses more day to day and trying to look more strategically rather than that last line of defense as a consultant, as it was before. It's amazing to me how disconnected we are, whether it's personally or from a business perspective, to how dependent we are on nature. I think, yeah, it's just we just take it for granted, basically.
And I guess the process of unlearning is oftentimes much harder than learning itself. So let's trace your steps. So you did your Master's in Science and Environmental Science at the University of Sheffield, and you finished in 2012. Then you sprinkled in a bit of geographic information systems to, I guess, consolidate your expertise there. So there's the environment and geography elements coming in. And as you said, you worked as a consulting engineer and then moved into, I guess, a specialist and senior ecologist, where you stayed for 5 years looking at the more ecology side. I noticed that you looked at, I guess, amphibians and bats as part of your work. I've certainly worked with amphibians, so they're quite fun to, I guess, read about, to look at, to observe as well.
Yeah, it's funny because it definitely wasn't a choice. And this is what many ecologists find themselves specializing in the UK, because it's purely driven by the legislation and this Protected Species Act. So we have national legislation, which dates back to like the 80s. And then we have European legislation, which is, after leaving the EU, we still adhere to. But while I was doing that job, that was pre-Brexit. So that was all still in place. And amphibians, so great-crested newts in particular. Listeners may be aware of this species. So very specific legislation around this endangered species. And that's a European level legislation. And actually there are they're not doing too badly in England, in particular, in certain areas of England, which means that you end up with quite strict legislation around any harm to them or any destruction of their habitat specifically. But they pop up everywhere. So they end up causing, from a developer perspective, a lot of problems because they often halt housing developments from going ahead, and you have to do the surveys to find them or to work out what the population of them is at very specific times of year. So they've got this rep, and if you Google the Great Crested Newt in the UK anyway,
which I just did,
find these news articles of like one newt or a small population of newts stops 500 houses from being built, and this poor species has become this scapegoat almost for poor planning or poor, it's really quite sad in how it's become a little bit chastised for it's nothing to do with the newt. The newt didn't actively go out to stop these housing developments. But yeah, so that became, I had to learn about amphibians and that species and the group of species that we have 3 species of newt in England specifically. So that became a specialism, and you have to get a license to be able to handle them and work with them. So a lot of ecologists end up going down that route. And then also bats are another species that are protected. All species of bats are protected with similar legislation, and they cause a lot of issues because it's very difficult to know if they're in a building. So if a building's being demolished or being altered, it's very difficult to go in and find them because they're very small. They can hide in very small crevices. So this leads to the requirement to do a number of these surveys where I have lots and lots of, it was definitely an interesting experience. And it's a bit of a rite of passage for ecology consultants in England and the UK, is that spending a lot of time sitting outside of buildings with a bat detector, looking at dusk or at dawn, waiting to see if any bats emerge or re-enter buildings. So I spent a lot of hours in a camping chair staring at a pub that was going to be demolished or something like that, just to see if any bats would emerge. And it's really difficult as well. It's a really tricky skill because it requires a sort of meditative mind where you have to just sit still. And this is very difficult for, I don't know how much you can relate to this, Peter. You might be a very mindful person. But for the majority of people anyway, these days, we're not very good at just sitting still and watching a building. So actually learned a lot about that, and actually got me onto like thinking a bit more about mindfulness and sitting still, which is a weird a side effect of doing bat surveys. But
the multiple benefits of bats.
Yeah, exactly. And people don't realize. So that was interesting, and it became a specialism as well. And you end up getting funneled a little bit down this path of specialism just because that's where all the work is and all the money's coming in. And it was frustrating. I was learning a lot and enjoying it, but it was frustrating because I was like, how is this the way that we're approaching species conservation? It's essentially picking 3 or 4 groups of species that are endangered, making legislation around that's very clunky, and then almost trying to just grab them as the digger is about to destroy the building and save that one individual. And it's not thinking at a bigger level. It's not thinking at a population level or ecosystem level. And we're still losing habitat gradually over time. And a lot of ecologists were feeling this, and this was the tone of the conversation. So that has begun to change now, and that's what led me on to finding a bit of a different role, Environment Bank, after that.
Yeah, so from looking at individual species, really trying to go in thinking if you can sort of change things in a patchwork style, it might change the overall picture. And I'm not saying that's the wrong way of doing things. I think there's benefits in that approach, but also the higher level approach, and I guess learning some mindfulness in the process.
Exactly.
But as you said, now Environment Bank, you've been with them for over 6 years as an associate ecologist and innovation lead, and it's given you the chance to actually look at a much higher level. And so that brought in a term that I thought was very interesting, and it relates to, I guess, current legislation that's sort of coming out. It's been around in the UK for quite some time, and the EU has just passed a bill, the nature credits, that is striving to protect biodiversity and in a way using a financial mechanism for that. Maybe to start with some, I guess, 101 on this. So the terms I refer to are habitat banks and environment banks. What are these?
It's a good question. So to go back to that, as you just mentioned, this attempt to move away from last line of defense, looking at species individually and trying to think more holistically. ecologists were thinking, well, how can we do that in a simplistic way that, because the thing with ecology and biodiversity is this is an ongoing challenge. There's thousands of metrics and it's very local.
Oh, yeah.
And you can get more and more complicated and layer more and more things on top.
And more species.
So the debate was going on for a number of years. So what is enough to measure just to get going? We know it's not going to be perfect, but the classic phrase of don't let perfect be the enemy of the good kept coming up. And if we overcomplicated things, it was already getting pushed back, this idea from the sectors that it would impact, because they thought it was going to have a huge financial and less financial, more time burden on them. And it would be a pain. It'd be a thing they had to deal with in the planning system. So it was decided that, well, in the development context, it's always an impact on the land. So there's a take of land. There are impacts through other things, through the supply chain, through the materials they're using. But let's focus firstly on the land impact that it's having.
I guess it's something we can see and we can work with.
Exactly.
It's got area. Yeah.
It's got area. It's something that you don't have to have a PhD or a master's in ecology to understand. You can go to anyone and say, you are impacting this 200 square meters of grass. Therefore, you need to either avoid it, don't do that, or if there's no other alternatives, you need to find a way to replace that. So that's what led to this concept of biodiversity net gain. And as you mentioned, this wider concept, which Environment Bank pioneered, the company that I joined. And that's why I got excited when I saw the founder, David Hill, talking about this idea that could we not just think of it in silos and think, right, one development is impacting 20 meters of grass. So they have to go out and negotiate with a farmer or whatever to replace 20 meters. Could we locally pool all these requirements? So we have 100 developments. In total, they're impacting 2, 3, 4, I don't know, whatever it is, hectares of land. Pool that resource together and then do something more impactful. So start using it to restore nature in a meaningful way, because in the UK anyway, and across most of Europe, like habitats have been degraded quite significantly. We've lost above 90% of a lot of our important habitats. So this was seen as a way to a kind of market mechanism to start, at least initially, mitigating that gradual attrition of habitats and nature that the development sector was having. It was going unrecorded. So you were protecting those species like the bats and the newts, but the gradual loss of habitat was just going unrecorded. So it was really a way to start, firstly, bringing in some numbers behind the mitigation hierarchy. So for those that don't know, that's this thing that's baked into ecology work, which is that you go through these steps of avoid first where you can, to avoid impact. Then if you can't avoid it, you mitigate or you try and minimize the damage. And then finally, if you can't and there's no alternatives, then you have to compensate for it. So it was all built around this. And without getting too technical, this government metric that DEFRA have produced, it has all these different factors built in, which is meant to actually reinforce that, where it makes it quite difficult and very, very, very costly to compensate for habitats that are very rare. And this is actually, and we're seeing this now, which is great. This is what was meant to happen, is that it's pushing those developments to look elsewhere. They're going, well, it's not worth us building this housing estate on this very rare heathland because the cost is going to be way too high. Let's build it further down the road on an area of degraded farmland, because although it's slightly less optimal from a, I don't know, location perspective, it's going to save us a lot of money. So we are seeing that play out. But the idea is that if they can't do that, or if they're impacting low quality habitat, they still have to give back. And it's called net gain because they have to give 10% on top of that. So it's not just a no net loss, it's additional. And that's what leads into the extra funding that's going into these habitat banks, which are trying to do something impactful with that compensation stage of the process, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And I think to fully understand that, I think we need to dive a bit into the biodiversity net gain policy, or the law that the UK has passed, mandatory since February 2024, actually. As you mentioned, people have to provide 10% of net gain on all habitats. And I believe it's at least for 30 years. That's sort of the time frame they've put up. I think you can't really put time on biodiversity, but we know ecology kind of changes over time as well. So it's very hard to predict what's going to happen. And yeah, as you mentioned, it's, I guess, these banks ensure spatially that, we are not just shoving the problem in one place and putting the benefits elsewhere, that we're actually consciously thinking about the ecosystem. I can think of parallels for water in Australia. Australia, where when you manage water or stormwater across a catchment, oftentimes you have to consider how the water flows through the environment. And so, there's this stormwater offset scheme that if developers cannot treat stormwater before it enters the receiving waters, they can pay a levy sort of to the water authority, which will then go and plan out a bigger system elsewhere, but within the same catchment. So it's more conscious of the spatial scales, more conscious of how the processes actually work, which in terms of water, it's kind of straightforward because water flows downhill, although people seem to forget that at times. But in terms of biodiversity, that's a bit more complicated, given, how we've talked about two species, how they're very different, and references we've made in previous episodes as well to just how it's very variable, very diverse.
Yeah, and this is the challenge, the ongoing challenge is, as I said before, we pick habitats as a proxy for biodiversity was picked because it was simple to understand and it could get going. And then almost immediately, and rightly so, questions start coming through of, well, let's monitor what impact that's actually going to have for species. So there is this big push, and it's happening on all our habitat banks anyway, where we are monitoring the impact, because it isn't just about, there's so many other things, as you hinted to there, that go into a biodiverse ecosystem. It's not just about, if you put a patch of grassland in one place, that'll have a different impact to putting it in another place because of the connectivity it has to other things, what's already there. Is it isolated in a desert of arable fields, or is it connected to a wildlife site next door? So, a lot of that thinking actually goes into planning where these habitat banks should go to try and make sure that they're not isolated and that they are expanding on existing areas, ideally.
And it's very good to see, because what people tend to forget, diversity, it's not just about having a whole collection of different species in a single patch of land, but part of the diversity is allowing the species to move across the region, because genetic diversity. So if, some newts, frogs, or whatever you want to call it, can move across the landscape to mate with others, oftentimes the gene pool is much more diverse, hence the diversity. And that's just one element of it.
Yeah, so loads of things that are going into this, that it's, when you break it down to just blocks of habitat, that's very simplistic. So it's trying to balance that need to get going with the bigger picture. And luckily, ecologists working on this understand, and there always has to be an ecologist involved in the process. It wasn't like they just produced a calculator and handed it off to the developers themselves to just use and to go, right, brilliant. Like they would, I don't know, an engineering tool where you might be able to apply it quite simplistically. It always needs an expert in the process. So that means that there is nuance that's allowed to be applied. And it'll be interesting to see how it evolves, because there's already conversations about bringing in other elements into this metric, like species elements and things. But the tricky thing is that you'll create more questions and more problems by, this is the thing with biodiversity metrics, is that it is inherently local thing that So even just having one metric nationally in England, which isn't a huge country, is problematic in a way because it's so variable. So that's already had to compromise to some extent. But as soon as you start bringing in other metrics, they're also very local. And it just spirals a little bit. So it's a constant debate outside of biodiversity net gain of how do businesses understand their impacts on nature? What metrics should they use to measure it? Should they be looking at just their site level? Should they be looking across their whole supply chain? It's a complex topic in a way, but that doesn't mean that we don't know how to measure it. It's just figuring out which are the best metrics and the best ways to measure it for a certain context.
I guess what helps make the decisions in the first place, to help the decisions be confident as well, which is hard with holistic approaches and context-specific case studies. And as you mentioned, the UK, small country, but it's a large amount of land. And there's a lot of diversity there. I was blown away when I delved into soil biodiversity for the first time. And, that patch of grass there can have a completely different flora and fauna or microbiota than a patch of grass just 100 meters later. So, scales as well.
Yeah, soil. I never thought I would be so fascinated by soil as I have become over the years studying ecology. And as I said before, the broadening of the metrics that we're looking at to measure change, particularly as in the UK, a lot of our land is farmland and it's working within the food system as well. So there's been a lot of amazing work that's been done to try and understand soil ecology from the farming and agriculture sector, purely from a production standpoint, I guess, and looking at how they can get better crop yields. But that's led to fascinating insights and technology innovation when it comes to looking at what's going on in the soil. I mean, I think 50% of all nature and biodiversity is within the soil. So it's when we talk about biodiversity restoration, it's often easy to start thinking about charismatic species and things, but really, like, most of life, over half of life, is located beneath our feet in the soil, which is pretty mind-blowing. And that can be everything from worms to microbes to all sorts of things that's living down there. And eDNA, environmental DNA, has been around for a little while, but it's really started making its way out of just academic circles and into the wider world of industry and to consulting and things like that, and to the food system as well. And really, at a lower cost, starting to be able to analyze what's happening in the soil and start asking questions that we couldn't ask before. So a big thing in ecology is that we've had to rely, because the technology's not been there, on indicator species. So we've looked at whether it's a certain plant or a certain animal that occurs in a system, and we look at that, and if it's there or if it's absent, or depending on the numbers that are there, that gives you an indication of the condition. But now we can start to ask different questions. We can look at what's happening in the soil, for example, and environmental DNA is a great way of doing that, because that's essentially taking a soil sample and analyzing it and using metabarcoding to look at what's in there. And it'll tell you everything from fungi to microbes to invertebrates that are living in the soil. And then you can start to ask, with the evolution of AI models and things like that, you can start to analyze loads and loads of data very quickly, start to ask questions around, if this certain thing is occurring in high numbers, what does that tell us about the soil? Or if it's occurring alongside this other thing, we've got a high level of bacteria and a low level of invertebrates, that tells you something quite clear about the soil. So
environmental DNA. So it's like a tracer system where you can sort of take a sample, and then using or looking at the DNA within that sample that I guess animals and microbiota leave behind, you can start to figure out what's been there or what may still be there. And then using those patterns, you can start to figure out where this occurs across an entire space, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah. So they leave behind a trace of DNA that's in the soil not for too long, but for enough time that when you gather a sample, you've got a realistic expectation that it was there. And this starts to allow you to build a picture of the health of the soil, how these things are interacting. It's really a powerful tool that it has its limitations, obviously, but I think when you pair it alongside existing methodologies that we have in ecology, it can really start to tell this more holistic picture of biodiversity, which we need to tell, because it's not just about necessarily one or two species, as we talked about earlier. It's about the whole health of everything. And sometimes things are obvious. And of course, an unhealthy soil will start to leave signs above ground. You'll start to see what's happening with vegetation. But being able to use this technology in eDNA specifically to look at what's happening beneath our feet where we can't see it in the microscopic is starting to bring forward some, unsurprisingly, highlight more problems and things that are going on, but also allow us to start thinking, how do we change things and monitor that over time?
I have to get rid of this because this just occurred to me. So I just got back from Venice recently, and this analogy might help, I guess, shed some light on it. So it's like if you're looking for someone, or if you're traveling with someone and they love to drink espresso macchiatos, and you sort of lost them in Venice, but they went to a cafe. You just got to go to a cafe where maybe they sat outside and just finished an espresso macchiato, and then you're like, okay, they were here.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So you don't need to find them necessarily at that time, but if they were there recently and they just finished their espresso macchiato, then that's a nice little analogy for how eDNA works. But it's a tool in our arsenal now, I guess, as ecologists, to be able to tell this more holistic story of change, hopefully positive change, as we start to move the needle and change things and restore things.
Thinking back at it, maybe it wasn't that best analogy, but hey, why not? we try. Mm-hmm. So lots of different tools in our belts. As you said, indicators is still a tricky slope to navigate. But I guess the biodiversity net gain is, I guess, a step forward, because there's now something that people have to comply with to gain planning permission.
Yeah, exactly. The great thing about legislation is that it provides a level playing field and a set of rules that people have to conform to. And what it did for Environment Bank anyway, as a startup, was allow the business to grow and to bring in investment, because it brought certainty that there was going to be this requirement. And in other environmental markets, to use that phrase, which are occurring around the world, a lot of them are still voluntary. So they require businesses to either go, we feel like this is something we need to do because we depend on it, which is still tricky. It's still that we're getting there slowly, but in a voluntary context, it's still difficult, and particularly when it's a shared resource as well. So one business might go, well, why would I invest all this money in this project when it's called the free rider problem, isn't it? Listeners may be aware, but if there's another company that isn't, then it just doesn't really work. And what this legislation does is it gets rid of that free rider problem. And it's really one of the more interesting things that people don't realize about biodiversity net gain is that it wasn't like through lobbying. There was lobbying from the environment sector to do something about it. And as I said before, ecologists like myself were getting frustrated with the way that things were being done. So there was a bit of that. But the main voices were actually from the development sector itself.
Oh, really?
And it was those companies that saw themselves as the front runners who were doing things and not getting credit for it. This weird like human trait of, if we do things, we can't just feel good and keep it a secret. We have to, especially from a business perspective, there needs to be a competitive advantage anyway. So
I guess that's a good incentive.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I'm always looking for these. I'm a big fan of protesting and of raising our voices and saying that we need change and we need systems change. That's one side of it. But I'm also a big fan of finding other levers and ways that we can create change through like existing mindsets and things, because I feel like we can create change a lot faster that way. So
indeed.
This was a pure business incentive really for these couple of house builders that already felt like they were doing a lot. They were measuring their impacts on biodiversity and they were creating areas within housing estates, or in some cases they were doing voluntary offsets to show that they were giving back or they were mitigating their impact. Some of it was probably marketing, fair enough, but they felt like, why are they not getting the credit for this? Well, there's no way, apart from a nice brochure to show the impact. So actually a lot of the early push for this came from those frontrunners because they wanted this free rider problem to be mitigated through this legislation. So now every single builder has to comply, no matter if they're just building 2 or 3 houses or if they're building 500. They have to go through this same process of what are we impacting? Have we tried to avoid it? If not, how can we compensate for that in a measurable way? So it was, an interesting case that not many people really, I think people assume that it came just from the environmental sector or the Green Party or whatever lobbying for it. But actually there was a bit of that, but it was the private sector and actually some of the people that are now bound by this legislation that drove it forward. So I don't know if there are other cases of similar things happening in other sectors where it's been driven by the people that are actually going to be having to adhere to it. But I thought that was an interesting way it was drove forward.
No, definitely. I think that's, you wouldn't expect it, but it's nice to see that people do want to, I guess, capitalize on the value. Terrible word to use, but I guess that's how it is. Because this really is more the financial incentive or the financial mechanism for it. But I guess we have yet to see how the EU nature credits bill will affect a lot of developments across Europe, because it is still voluntary. And I think we have at least a bit of an idea that inaction is a problem. Trying to put it on the balance sheet, I think, will benefit. But with voluntary systems, there's always, I guess even with mandatory systems, there's always room for use and abuse. So time will tell. I think 2027 is sort of one of the deadlines for the nature credits bill. And maybe they can learn a lot from the biodiversity net gain.
Hopefully. There's a lot of questions still to be answered there. And there's a lot of great research that's been done into coming out of Oxford University and other groups of like how to do things and how not to do things. A lot of these systems have been tested for decades. Like in the US, for example, they've had mitigation banking with wetlands for a long time. In Australia, there's been offset markets there that have actually learned a lot of lessons by doing it the wrong way in some sectors. And there's loads of bad practice that can be learned from and good practice as well. So it's good that it's coming in now after a couple of decades of testing, really. But I think there's still a danger that those lessons won't be learned and could fall into old traps. And as you said, it's still at this stage voluntary. How easy is it going to be to convince businesses that they should be investing in nature restoration? A lot of them are still getting their heads around where they even get their materials and where their supply chains are. So it's not an easy one. And particularly things like biodiversity, it can often be difficult to make that feel material, to use the technical term, but feel relevant to a business specifically. So it's finding levers like, you mentioned water before. Water is a great one, and particularly at the moment, there's a drought across a lot of Europe.
It's more visible.
It's more visible. So something I'm thinking about a lot is, there's probably some quicker wins that we can use that are hard. It's not as much of a long tail negotiation, whereas it might be with biodiversity. Water dependency is right here and now for most businesses in a lot of sectors, and then using nature-based solutions, nature-based projects to tackle those problems, whether that's wetland restoration or bringing in species like beavers, for example. There's a lot of that going on in England at the moment, to use nature to hold back water or to purify water. And then you've got this a win-win, which I hate the phrase win-win because it's very often not a win-win, but trying to create more positive benefits rather than just, because the easy option might be to just put a reservoir in, for example. Yeah. But if you create a wetland, you have extra benefits as well.
The multifunctional design, oftentimes then you maximize the return on the investment. And biodiversity can be taken care of if you strategically plan the nature-based solutions. You'll still have to consider where it is in the spatial scale of things and the spatial arrangement. But I think we are starting to realize that much of the solutions we put in place can deliver more than a single benefit.
Yeah.
And so at the Environment Bank, you, I guess, act as, in a way, a mediator, a controller, encouragement kind of body for people embarking on these kinds of projects. What are the diversity of projects that you do?
Yeah, we are primarily a project developer ourselves, we call ourselves. So we create these habitat banks, which are, to get a little bit into the detail, we have an investor who is on board, and we can draw down funds which can secure an area of land. So we go into a partnership with a farmer usually. So we don't buy land. There's an arrangement put in place, a lease arrangement in England, but in other countries doesn't necessarily have to be a lease. It's just a way of securing a project for the long term. You mentioned earlier, with all these, there's a minimum requirement of 30 years. Mm-hmm. And we would love it to be longer and eventually in perpetuity. But I think a big important thing is that the funding for that project is secured from day one. And as soon as you get beyond 30 years to 50 to 100, there's a lot of funding to draw down and to secure.
That's true. Yeah.
There's a cost to that. So we secure that funding, and then that is paid back through the sale of these various credits over time. So it's a way that we can convince a farmer to do these projects over the long term, because if we said to them, sorry, we have to wait until we sell a few credits over here and a few credits over there before you can start working on this project, it would be a difficult sell. So our big sell at Environment Bank is we have to borrow money, so there is a cost to that, but it allows us to say to the farmer or whoever the landowner is, it might be a wildlife trust or a charity or whoever owns the land, here's this income for 30 years is secure for you to do this management and get paid to do this management, to have this biodiversity uplift. And then we take care of the sale of those credits. So for the farmer who often doesn't want to be dealing, there's a lot to do to manage the land.
And it can get very complicated.
Yeah, to negotiate a deal with a corporate entity is quite tricky. So Environment Bank's place in that is to help develop the project and to bring the ecological expertise with the farmer or the landowner, and then to convert that into these various credit types and make it relevant to a business. So it's joining those two dots. A business could go out and negotiate directly with a landowner, and they do that, but we're trying to make it a little bit easier for both sides and be that mediator, like you say.
Yeah, lowering the barrier to entry, the barrier to actually doing these projects, and I guess taking care of the complexity around it. And in a way, a very good example of how we can implement these kinds of systems, these kinds of schemes. And you armed yourself with more sustainable finance knowledge as well by doing a course at the University of Cambridge in 2024. So you're pretty much across the disciplines now, ecology, but also more on the economic side.
Yeah, this is just my nature, is that I feel like I need to learn everything and have knowledge of everything and get imposter syndrome very easily. So that's probably not I have learned to gradually relax that over time. And I'm sure you've come across this as well. As you get a little bit older, you realize that there's always someone that knows more than you. And actually, I'm quite comfortable now becoming a generalist and having little bits of knowledge across and bringing areas of knowledge together that maybe aren't usually brought together. So yeah, doing that finance course was interesting. And in the past, I might have thought, right, I need to go and do a whole degree in it and become an expert in it. But now I realize that if I can just get little bits of knowledge and take away a couple of ideas, that might just spark something, or it might just sit there in my mind dormant for a little while, and then one day someone will talk about a green bond or something and I'll have some knowledge. At least I won't be starting from scratch. That course was interesting actually, because I went into it thinking that I would learn all about finance, but it was actually for people working in finance to learn about sustainability. So I actually ended up teaching a lot of people on the course about sustainability, and had to almost do my own research in the background to upskill, because they were already fluent in the language of sustainable loans and green bonds and things like that, which I was like, yeah. So it was interesting. And they made you go through an exercise of creating a product for a sustainable product, which was quite interesting. So yeah, it was worth doing, but maybe naively thought it was going to teach me all about banking, but it didn't.
Yeah. Well, I guess sometimes the best way to learn is to teach others, and maybe they would have also given you some leads to then search up and upskill as well, as you mentioned. But you also remind me of an old quote that I saw a new rendition of, which I think really reflects the world we're in. And they say, a jack of all trades, master of none. But the quote continues, and I read, but it's better than a master of one.
Oh, really? I didn't know that. I didn't know that quote continued.
I saw it on LinkedIn, so it could have been invented. But hey, I resonated with the message, and I thought,
yes, agreed.
This has been the strategy I've taken myself to diversify. And I think, through your experience in music production as well, and also blogging, you've actually leveraged that for your environmental mission. And that is a topic I'd like to get into. And that, I guess, beginning with Innovate Eco. Tell me about Innovate Eco. And that also includes a podcast that you do yourself.
Yeah, where to start? So that is exactly born out of, as I said before, this kind of curiosity and wanting to learn. And also that time when I was working as a consultant and felt this frustration that we weren't really making a change and weren't really having the impact that I thought I might have. And watching the news and seeing that things were not getting any better. And it was at the time, not on Twitter or X as it's known now, but I was at the time, and it just felt like a stream of of things getting worse to me, and actually culminated in me taking a little bit of a hiatus from just like watching the news and things, because it was just getting too depressing. But then I thought, and I'm still, I'm a little bit more connected, and I've learned over the years that you actually absorb things by osmosis anyway.
Is that true? Really?
I think, I mean, a bit of a side note, but during COVID, even more so, I'd had enough. I felt completely burned out from news and just stopped watching it for a couple of months. But it didn't feel like I didn't know things were just entering, like whether it's through conversations or overhearing things on the train or whatever it might be. You just hear about things, and I didn't feel like I was completely. Occasionally there'd be a bit of celebrity gossip that I hadn't heard, that kind of thing.
That's always
that's always So anyway, at that point, I was feeling this frustration that I was only hearing negative news, and thought, right, maybe I can go out and start trying to find some people that are doing positive things in the world, and bring a bit of mainly for my own sanity, to be honest. A lot of best projects do start from a bit of scratching your own itch, don't they, in a way. And
that is so true.
I just wanted to connect with people that were doing positive things, just to make me feel a bit better about the way things were going. And at the time, podcasting, it was 2018, podcasting felt like this very tricky thing that wasn't accessible to everyone, which is weird to say now because things have moved on so much. But at the time, which was only like 6 years ago, it felt quite inaccessible. But I did have this background, as you said, in music production. So I had the equipment. I felt like I knew how to record audio. I had software already on my computer, so I knew how to do that and edit it. So why not? And then at the time, the author Seth Godin was launching a course on podcasting to try and get, well, his whole thing is like trying to get people to ship stuff and publish stuff and get their work out into the world. That's like one of his big mantras. And he posted on Twitter that he was going to give away 5 free places on this podcasting course if people sent in their idea for a podcast. So I was in the office that day and just typed out a tweet saying, at the time I thought my working title was The Disruptive Environmentalist, which was I wanted to find people that were trying to disrupt the status quo in a positive way.
Very cool title.
And yeah, that's what I went with. And then I gave my little blurb in the number of characters you're allowed. And then he picked it as one of the 5. So I got to do this course, which is great, and be mentored by him, which is pretty cool. and get tips on how to record and things that feel quite basic now. But at the time, it was a bit trickier to get your podcast onto like all the feeds and stuff like that. There was a bit of technical knowledge there. So, and more than anything, it just got me started. It was something that I would have just kicked the can down the road, and it might even have got to now, and I would have been thinking, oh, that podcast that I never started, I wish I'd started it. And it's become a bit of a theme of my life of just like trying stuff and testing stuff and seeing what happens.
Hey, I'm just hearing echoes of my own life. So
yeah. So that was the working title, and it was really, I wanted to go out and find anyone that was doing something positive, and that could be building a business, an academic that's trying to tackle a problem but in like a more positive, proactive way. It could be a charity or something like that. So the first series I did was a real mix. It was everything from a campaign that was trying to get more water filling stations all around London, and this issue around how at the time anyway, it's definitely improved a lot. There was nowhere to fill up your water bottle. So that was like something quite basic but simple. And then others like building businesses, like circular economy type businesses. And yeah, it was great. And I did it for a while, paused it when I just got too busy with life and things just kind of got a bit sidetracked. And then people kept asking me if I was going to start it again. I actually had people reaching out to me saying, would I have them on? And I changed the focus a little bit to be more, because of the audience I was getting, to be more focused on founders and people building businesses specifically, rather than just anyone doing something positive. And that's when I changed the name of it to Innovate Eco, which I like. I'm still not, I don't know if you have this, Peter, but I always find a reason to like start disliking a title, and then I'm like, I should have done this, and maybe I should change it again.
You learned it out yourself, but
yeah,
you just have to push on.
Exactly. So I just pushed on with that, because the reason the disruptive environmentalist was I liked it, but I didn't realize at the time that to a lot of people that term means someone that sits in the road and protests and is causing disruption. So I got a lot of people confused. They were like, oh, is it about protesting, and is it about that side of things? Like, no, not really. So that's why I changed it a bit. And yeah, I've started doing it again and recording every couple of weeks episodes with founders really who are building businesses that are trying to tackle various environmental challenges. And I love entrepreneurship and trying to tackle problems through business. I think it's a fun, I've just always had that entrepreneurial thing in me somewhere. So it's been fun. It's really a great way to keep me positive and connect with people doing positive things, and just mitigate a little bit of that negativity that is still there, obviously. And there's still a lot of problems out there, but it just, helps me and hopefully helps other people listening. Like my main aim with it is to try and inspire other people to start that thing.
And so we'll definitely put a link to that podcast in the show notes so that listeners can check it out. Very cool series. So do continue that. I look forward to it. And entrepreneurial spirit, that's also related to your latest venture, which I really liked, especially the message around it. And it reflects a lot of the societal challenges we face in getting people to adopt more sustainable practices. And so No Longer Known, I guess one key word, t-shirts. Can you enlighten me on that?
Yeah. So through doing the podcast for a while, I had a question, which I do on every podcast episode, which is at the end, I ask the guest to share an idea. And because being entrepreneurial, as they often are, or pretty much always are as a founder, they will, pretty much every single one will have a list somewhere of businesses that they never started. And I thought, well, let's share these and try and get more people starting these businesses. And after a while, people started to ask me, well, when are you gonna launch your business? When are you going to either take one of these ideas and do it? And I did think to myself, I was like, it is the whole point of this podcast is to try and inspire people to do something and start. I should probably give it a go myself. So
you got inspired by your own work.
Exactly. And so then I went to my list of business ideas that I'd had over time. And one of the key things that I'd noticed from what I'd learned in the trends from people I had on the podcast was that a lot had said, if you can find a way to start with a co-founder that has a nice balance of skills, and ideally someone that you know very well and trust, that's a bonus, because it will just give you this extra momentum and you'll be able to share the workload and it'll be more fun. And there are pros and cons to co-founders. I've heard a lot of stories of bad breakups with stuff, but that's, that comes with the territory. But I thought, okay, that does sound like a good idea. And because I want to start it a bit on the side and not just go all in, like having someone else working on it would be good. And so I looked through the list and there was one idea on there that I'd been thinking about for ages, since like 2016. And it was this idea that me and my brother had. And it probably helps to tell the little story, the kind of origin story of it, because it wasn't a eureka moment. It was a gradual unpacking of various ideas. And so it started, we were both between jobs, coincidentally, back in 2016. And we had a few weeks off and we just said to each other, well, should we just go on a bit of a holiday and have a bit of a relaxing time? And we looked at where was cheap to get to, and the south of Spain, and had good weather. I think it was in November. So we were like, let's go to the south of Spain. And me being me, I was immediately looking for like what nature reserves are around and how I can find ways to go and look for some nature spots. I can never have a day, I'm having a break, but like even on my holidays, I'm still looking for nature, which I think is a good sign.
Yeah, it's recuperating. So.
It is. I find it recuperating. And on the southeast coast of Spain, there's a national park called the Doñana National Park. And there's a population of Iberian lynx, which are a very rare species. At the time, their numbers were, I think there were only around 500 individuals left in the world of this one species. So
that's not a lot.
Really rare. I think before that, they were down to like 200 at their lowest point. So I said to my brother, while we're there, we have to go and go on a lynx tour. We have to go and try and see one of these lynx. Like it might be the last chance we get. Like if their populations continue to decline, like this might be a species that disappears forever. And I wasn't expecting this at the time, because I think to me, I'd become numb to like the fact that biodiversity loss is happening. Extinction is rising, where the background extinction rate is like 1,000 times higher than it should be. And we're technically, many people say we're in a mass extinction event right now. So to me, it's like this thing that is just baked into my knowledge. But to my brother, who I thought, he likes nature, he would say he likes to go out in nature, although he does live in a city. So maybe there is a bit of a disconnect there. And he said, I had no idea about this species in particular, the Iberian lynx. It's living in Spain, not that far away. It's really cool. Like he hadn't even looked at pictures of it before. It's this quite striking cat. And he's like, not only did I not know it existed, but I didn't know that it was on the verge of being extinct. And there's a chance, if you hadn't told me about it, I could have found out about it in 20 years as something like the dodo or the dinosaurs. Like it's something that I never got a chance to even know about. Like I did, let alone see. So this started a conversation around that, and we went to go and see it, and we were lucky enough to see one in the wild. So that, which was amazing, and actually a slightly it really brought it home as well, because we saw one and then almost immediately it got chased away by a dog.
Oh, no.
And that's one of the main threats, as it is often now. It's the interaction between humans and the wildlife. That one of their main threats is from habitat change, but also from dogs that are off the lead, end up injuring them. And then it happens all the time. So we actually witnessed that. And again, for my brother, it was this, I had no idea that they were so vulnerable, and they're just living alongside humans, really close to them here. And so that, again, the conversation kept going, and we thought he was at that point convinced we needed to do something about this, and how he saw himself as a blueprint, a proxy for like everyone else. And he thought he was quite well connected. So people that aren't connected at all to what's happening with extinction and biodiversity loss, it's like that. So we started chatting about this, like, why is this happening? Why are we not aware of what's going on? Is it a conscious decision that we're just pretending? And he was like convinced it's not. He wasn't like burying his head in the sand. It was just something that he just wasn't necessarily aware of. And we were over a few beers chatting about like traditional conservation approaches and how they don't feel that accessible. And I was just quizzing him like why, and if a lot of them feel like they're for retired people, again, like the volunteers, like I said before, like they're not really that interesting or exciting. They don't like, the lynx is something that's really cool and exciting, and he was like energized by it. But when he thinks about donating to a charity, or it didn't feel that he was connected to it in the same way. So we were like looking for parallels in society around like, why do people get hooked on things or addicted to things? And he mentioned, which at the time it was a growing trend, and it's only got bigger and bigger, was this drop culture, it's called, which is
drop culture.
Yeah, like the term for And limited edition things has always been a thing, but it's been rising and rising with social media, being able to build hype and community online, and particularly around t-shirts and t-shirt brands.
There we go.
And yeah, so that's the link. That took me a long time to get there, Peter, but we got there eventually.
And it's a lovely story.
Thank you. But yeah, t-shirts, there's a few brands that I could name. Supreme is a good example, that have created like this cult-like community they will release a limited edition design, a few hundred, and they'll build this hype online. And then sometimes they go out to a place and they'll gather like thousands of people. There's videos online I can share with you of like people in the back of a van handing out these t-shirts to like crowds of thousands and thousands of people.
Oh, wow.
And we were like, this is interesting, and definitely an interesting insight into human behavior. But like at the end of the day, it's just consumerism and nonsense. Like really, it's just like, what is it? It's just so then we thought, right, well, then we made this link between endangered species and not being very many left, like the Iberian lynx. We're only 500 at the time. And could we use this like hype generation limited drop idea to raise awareness of these species? So that was in 2016, and we chatted about it pretty much every time we saw each other. And so when I got to this point of like, right, I need to launch something, I need to do something, that idea just stood out on the page. And yeah, it's been a few months now of building it quite transparently. So actually on the podcast Innovate Eco, there's a side series where we're just really catching up, me and my brother, just chatting about what we've been working on that week and the challenges that come with building a business. And yeah, it's expanded from just being this way of cutting through the noise and raising awareness to actually suddenly all these other potential co-benefits of the brand are emerging around. It's a great way to be able to talk about the issues of sustainable fashion, like the idea of it being limited and being limited edition is it's going back to treasuring items a bit more and really feeling a connection to something rather than something that we wear and we just throw away and it's this transient item. So there's a bit of that, and also around, we've learned, so I was definitely not an expert in terms of sustainable fashion, and we're still learning, but new materials that are coming in and the issues with cotton and things like that. So that's an ongoing discussion, which is interesting. And it's a way to bring that conversation out. And then the other one, so I should have said before, my brother isn't an ecologist, comes from a design background. So his whole background is, I was the one that went and did science, and he's the one that went and did art and did design. It feels like that
complementary skills
happens the way, and exactly, complementary skill sets.
Yeah.
So he brought that to it, and he was saying for him, what worries him and a lot of his friends who work in that space is the rise of AI art and all the accessibility to just being able to produce art quickly. And so very early on, we said, well, we want these designs to be unique. So if it's an Iberian lynx, we want it to be a unique, cool design, but not just something that's generated on AI. We want it to have a story behind it as well. And so that got us talking about, well, it would be really cool to find a local artist to collaborate with, share the profits with, and to just collaborate on the design with, and to get their work out there to kind of tackle this anxiety that I'm sure a lot of artists have, where they're like, well, how am I going to sell my art when someone might just produce something with AI that looks really cool as well? So
that is a big worry nowadays with a lot of the new tools coming out. But I guess humans like a good story. They like to latch onto it.
Exactly. So that is now baked into it, that each one's going to be a unique design with a local artist, because it's all about the story and creating something that has meaning and isn't just another something that you just buy and throw away. So yeah, it's kind of become this something that's a bit bigger than what we started out planning, and we're trying not to tackle too many issues, but it's proved to me that when you start building something, you learn so quickly, and it also opens up space for conversations around multiple things that maybe you didn't even expect.
I mean, just the phrase, hey, cool t-shirt, if it's one of your t-shirts, can already spark a very lengthy conversation. I mean, you've got three elements at play here. The first one being sustainable materials and processes, and I'm reordering them on purpose. The second one being the local artist, so keeping the human element in the design and telling a story around it. And the third one coming back to the original reason, which is the biodiversity. And that's where the uniqueness of the product sort of telegraphs the scarcity. And that is that you are only going to be selling as many t-shirts of a particular species as they are estimated to still be left in the world. world.
Exactly, which is a challenge as an ecologist because often that number is
Yeah, it does
it's hard to
fluctuate.
come by. But I'm going to put that out there now that we're going to be transparent and we'll pick a number and it might not be correct. I mean, an interesting example is I was looking at this morning is this antelope called the Saola, which is in Vietnam.
Okay.
And they estimate there's only 200 of these left.
Oh, wow.
And no one has seen one for like several years in the wild.
That's crazy.
Like they've got them on camera traps, but no one has physically seen one. So that shows you how difficult it is sometimes to know exactly. But we'll make an estimate. And you're right, like that was one of the main drivers, is that if it has a cool, unique design, my hope is that someone will, it could be a family member or a friend who goes, that's interesting. Like, is that a brand or whatever? And that starts that conversation more naturally. Whereas for me, even as someone who's really passionate about this, I'm quite introverted, and starting those conversations outside of my comfortable bubble is difficult. So if I don't want to sit down at the Christmas dinner table and say, Mum, Dad, what do you think about biodiversity loss and deforestation? Like, it's not a great jumping off point. Whereas if they talk about your t-shirt and you can say, this is something I'm really passionate about. Did you know this particular species lives in this area and there's not many left? Proceeds from this t-shirt are going towards protecting and trying to bring those species back. And then hopefully that'll start that conversation going. So that is a big part of it. It's all about trying to break out of this bubble, have conversations more widely.
And there's a quote on your website that I think really hits this home, and that is that scarcity isn't just marketing, it's a mirror of nature's reality. And I think people, once they realize that, I think will start to become more conscious.
Yep, that's the plan. And that links back to this limited drop idea, that it's not just about using it as a marketing tool, even though that is part of it. It's really about this story of biodiversity loss. And I guess to highlight as well that it comes back to our start of our conversation that which is quite funny to think about really, but like we got a bit too siloed in our thinking about charismatic species and not biodiversity as a whole.
Yep.
But I've come like full circle, because it is a great way to start that conversation about wider biodiversity. And if you start trying to tell people about microbes in the soil, they'll probably switch off, some people anyway. So it is useful. And we're going to be focusing on species that most people haven't heard of. That's the brand name No Longer Known, was really because even I, as an ecologist, just kept coming across species that were almost extinct that were just like something out of science fiction.
Okay.
Like whether it's a bird from Papua New Guinea that has this incredible plumage and does this mating display that looks like, something that you wouldn't see in the natural world. Or, like I said before, like this antelope that's called the Asian unicorn because of its really cool markings.
That's a cool name.
It is, isn't it? And so that excitement started in me, and hopefully will in other people, that they're like, elephants, tigers, pandas, great. We love them. We want to save them. But there's so much more going on, and highlighting interesting, unusual species that are at risk is hopefully going to inspire more people, whether it's adults or children, to start to think about animals that exist now on the planet that they're living on, that they can find wonder and intrigue in. And then that will start the wider conversation again about why that's happening. So we want to do, alongside everything we're doing, do social media content or whatever it might be to just raise awareness of the bigger issues, because it's, why are these species? That hopefully will be a natural question for people, like why are they declining? And it could be anything from something quite specific like poaching or illegal trade to gradual deforestation or human impact. So it's a way to talk about wider biodiversity loss. I don't want to fall into the trap of just thinking we're going back into this older world of just, focusing on one or two species. That's not kind of the aim. Yeah.
But as you put it, when you first contacted me, it's a cultural reboot for conservation, which I really liked. And I think that's important because, as you said before as well, or as you've mentioned to me when we first met, we're communicating a lot of these messages to people who are already passionate about biodiversity, but we need a much larger populace to become aware of this. And I think this is a very interesting way of doing it.
Yeah, it's something I've become quite fascinated by over my career, and probably through some of the work I've been doing at Environment Bank, where I was thrown into situations where I'm having to convince a farmer a lot of the time who had a slightly different approach to how they viewed wildlife or how they interacted with it, and having difficult conversations and trying to find that middle ground. I found it really, didn't think I would find it as rewarding and as fun as it was, but like trying to just like work out what it is that they can connect with, because they all do connect with nature. We all do. It's in us somewhere, even if it's harder to find. And whether it's the bird song that they hear when they're out in the fields, or it's a story from their childhood, or how they connected with, often it's, oh, remember when you were on the farm when you were younger and it felt there was a lot more nature, and annoyingly the government told you to get rid of all your hedgerows. Oh, like it's not your fault. Like you were just told to make more and more food. And then they suddenly go, yeah, like I don't feel blamed anymore. And we are kind of all trying to find that balance between, in that case, food production and nature. And so it's similar with No Longer Known, like you say, it's trying to find strands and ways into wider conversation. Although I do admire and respect a lot of the big conservation organizations and charities, and they are trying to do some creative things, but I think they're so established and they can't be too disruptive because they've already got things that they're working on and members and stuff. So it's quite, we feel like we are able to be a little bit more cheeky and disruptive and change things from the outside. So it's not to try and undermine the great work that's going on. And with a lot of the funding that we make from the t-shirts, we'll be partnering with a charity that's helping that particular species. So we'll be partnering. There'll be alignment, but it is that cultural reboot, that getting the message out in a different way that we're testing with No Longer Known. And I see as a real opportunity for other people that want to start things out there, that they can just try and think what's working in other, so in this case, limited drop t-shirts, but there might be other parallels in other industries that we can maybe tweak, because they've often involved a lot of people, well-paid psychologists in some case, like looking into human behavior. So yeah, is there a way that we can use that work for good?
Yeah, leveraging that, what has been established in, I guess, the marketing and economics and human behavioral research to then make a difference for the positive. So from my side, just curious, I love owls. Have you got any owls on your radar that are endangered?
That is a good question. And I wish I had some lined up. I'm sure, like, tragically, there will definitely be a number of owls that are critically endangered. Yeah, I would have to do a bit of Googling, unfortunately, Peter. I don't have any that completely to hand. But I will get back to you on that one, and I'll find an owl that, and we will definitely include an owl in one of our designs at some point. You've got my word.
Perfect.
Now, but yeah, like I love owls as well. It will be nice. And yeah, like they were a species that really, I don't know what it is about owls, but they was a species I was fascinated by as a kid as well. I think they're quite mysterious, aren't they?
No, I love owls.
They're nocturnal, those big eyes. I remember there was an owl sanctuary near where I grew up, and we used to go there quite a lot. Yeah, again, some of the species just didn't look real to me. They looked like they were from a cartoon or a drawing. And that, I guess, is one of those early encounters that started this ongoing fascination.
Yeah. And so what's the status of the business? I believe you're launching soon. Give me the gist. How can our listeners get access to these t-shirts?
So we are running it. As I said, we're kind of building it transparently. So if anyone wants to find out where we're at and what we're building, you can go to the Innovate Eco Podcast, and it's the startup diaries that we're doing there and transparently building this. And the debate really is like when to launch. Now having to learn. So we've launched like the website, so you can go to nolongerknown.com to sign up to the launch list and to be notified and to get, and we're going to build a community as well. We would like to bring people in, and still deciding what platform to do that on, a way for people to, like you just did, Peter, to send in an idea early on, or to have some input into just how important. We're going to run some polls, like just how important is material to you, like how important is cost, like really try and build it with the community involved. And that takes time, so it's going to be a little bit longer. And we want to get to this critical mass of energy and excitement where we have a certain number in there, so that when we do launch, it's not going to be a damp squib, and we'll have a good audience. And something that we keep referring to is this idea of 1,000 true fans. This Kevin Kelly
famous article
from Wired magazine that was essentially around convincing. It's not about trying to convince everyone, but finding this core fan base. So that's what we're focusing on at the moment. And we've been really overwhelmed and surprised with the amount of people that have signed up, not just friends and family, but like we've been getting a gradual trickle through without doing loads and loads of outbound marketing. And we're going to increase that and figure out, it's just a whole new world to me, and which has been exciting about it, because all my old jobs have been business to business. It's not been this direct to consumer approach. So I'm having to completely learn all about finding an audience, like social media marketing and stuff. So yeah, we're aiming to do the big launch either towards the end of the year or early next year, I think it's going to be. And we're deciding whether we do a smaller soft launch where we do an initial design to the early adopters, to the people that supported us early on, just as a test really. So that we might do that, and then have like a big launch, whether we go through a kind of crowdfunding type process or not, like probably some point in 2026. So for now, yeah, people go to nolongerknown.com. And it's really easy. You can see the full story there, as we've talked about a bit today. And you can sign up there to be first to be notified when we're doing these launches and to get involved. There'll be a link if you want to get involved with that community I said we're building as well. And yeah, just share it with as many people as you can. People you think might be interested in the idea, not necessarily huge nature enthusiasts already, but that's the whole aim, is to try and share this idea as widely as possible.
So you heard it, listeners, nolongerknown.com. I think you can sign up for a newsletter and you get updates as well on how it's going. And if you have ideas for animals, owls, do let Rob know. And I'm sure he will then keep you up to date with how it's going. I look forward to getting my first t-shirt, and my wife's already requested one. So
amazing. Thank you very much.
So
appreciate
we'll be in touch
the support. Thank you.
Otherwise, I'll contact you directly.
Yeah, no worries.
Rob, it's been incredible listening to your story and really just hearing how you've ventured out from one skill to really many disciplines and across many sectors, really trying to find solutions and taking time to understand the problem and not getting, I guess, jaded or demotivated by the whole process, and really trying to reach out to people and getting them to care more as well.
Thank you.
And like I do with every guest, I'd love to ask you more questions so that listeners can get to know more about you. And so in all you do, oftentimes the key word that comes to mind is innovation. So in your view, what does the word innovation truly mean, and how has it shaped the way you approach challenges, opportunities in your work?
I love this question. And I should be good at answering it because I literally have it in my job title and in my podcast. But I used to think of innovation, I'm sure many people still do. I used to think of it as tech, as purely tech. So like applying eDNA we talked about earlier, like environmental DNA as a tech solution or innovation for learning about soil health and what's happening there, or I don't know, whatever, like a new mobile phone as an innovation for how we communicate. But over time, I've grown to learn that it's a lot more than that. And for me, what's exciting and innovative is trying to find new ways to approach a challenge or to communicate a challenge, I think, is, as we're trying to do with No Longer Known, it's like finding different avenues to get to a different audience, because I just felt like we were on this treadmill with environmental problems and not really making much progress. So for me, when I'm thinking about innovation in the environmental space now, it's like, how do we apply that fresh perspective to our thinking, and how can we leverage or bring in research? It could be research, it could be business ideas from other sectors and parallel sectors into what we're trying to do. I think for me, innovation is about the bringing together of ideas, really.
The melting pot, essentially.
Yes.
And then seeing what comes out of it. Incredible. And often I think it's been overused in the world of tech. And so it's too easy to think about, inventing a new technology all the time. But I think it's really about a way of thinking. And it's nice that we realize that. And many guests have already reflected on that as well, for as long as this question has been around.
Nice.
Incredible.
Yeah, I like it. I like it as a question. It's great.
Yeah, thank you. So you told the story about the Iberian lynx, but was there any other key moment, event, or person that completely changed the course of your career or your mindset? Yeah,
this is an interesting one. Lots of different directions I could go in with this. I think, and it's kind of alludes to what I just talked about, of trying to become this master of all trades, or of learning from different disciplines. And I had this trying to read books as well when I had a bit more time, when I was a bit younger, which could bring in different mindset changes. And one for me that like completely changed, there are a couple I was going to mention. One that completely changed my way that I approached just day-to-day life was The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. I know there's Atomic Habits, which I didn't read till later on, which is perhaps more widely known. But it was, before that point, I hadn't quite realized how habitual we are as a species and how much easier things become when you start to think about things in habits. And some of the techniques he described in that book around tracking habits daily, starting simple and not trying to change too many things at once, and just building it into systems, and then tying one habit to another habit, I thought was really, really interesting. And it did completely change my life. And then that cascaded into everything else. So it was a really basic one. Was I just used to get so frustrated that I could never find time to exercise. It would be like whenever I felt motivated. And this is the trap, right? Like motivation, if you wait for motivation, it'll never come. It'll never come. Occasionally it does, but like very rarely. And so when you start thinking of it as a habit, just doing something every day. So those days where you're like, oh, it's raining outside and I really don't want to have to go out for a run. It's thinking, well, it's a habit, so I have to do it. And if I break it, then I have to start again. So that completely changed my approach to those things. And then everything else kind of falls into place after that, because it's not taking up that headspace anymore of, oh, when am I going to fit in this exercise? It's just something that is habit. And then also becoming comfortable with the fact that it's okay to fall out of habits, and you just have to acknowledge it and then try and get back into it when you can. Because initially when I read this book, I started doing it, and for 2 weeks I was thinking, this is amazing, my life's changed forever. And then I would stop doing one of them because I was busy or I went on holiday. So becoming comfortable with that, really. And I guess the other kind of link to that, the other book I read at a similar time is a book called War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, which he's like a fiction writer, but this book was a non-fiction book. And it talks about this concept, very basic concept he calls resistance, which is, again, if you wait for motivation and to be inspired to do anything, this thing called resistance will always creep in and you'll find a reason not to do it. So it's about just planning in the time and just doing it, even if you don't feel like doing it. So the combination of habit and War of Art and being mindful of this resistance, was those two books just got me into this new way of thinking that I should just do stuff anyway. And then you look back after 10 years and think, wow, like I've done a lot. Whereas in the moment it could have felt annoying and frustrating. But so yeah, maybe not the most like profound books, but like quite simple concepts. But they really did completely change my mindset to how I approach everything, really.
And I think sometimes we have to be reminded of simple concepts. I've read both books. I can certainly agree with you. You know, self-help has the danger of quickly becoming shelf-help. Yes. But I've read both. And if there are a few books I can recommend, they are definitely on my list as well. So
nice.
I read War of Art, not to be confused with Art of War. It's
yes.
a different one. I read that in 2020. I think I'm due for a reread because, we are fighting this active resistance and we have to overcome it. And oftentimes motivation only comes once you start taking action, and people forget that. But
yeah, exactly. Mood follows action.
Very good recommendations. Perfect. So, you have No Longer Known, you have Innovate Eco, and you work at the Environment Bank. So time management, of course, becomes an interesting question here. So what tips and strategies can you offer in terms of time management? We spoke about the habits.
Yeah, so habits is a big one.
How do you maintain a balance between your professional and personal time?
Yeah, and I've just got a 9-month-old baby, so there's that
congratulations.
challenge as well. So, but that more than anything, like before I was getting better at learning how to prioritize, that really, as soon as I thought about that and when he was born, really just brought everything into focus. That there's a lot of hours in a day, but we're very good at wasting them. And it was just really honed in on like, well, if you've got a couple of hours spare for whatever reason, a lunchtime or a commute, like really valuing time. And this isn't to say that you should be constantly on. It also made me like value that downtime as well, and kind of force downtime sometimes with like, spending that time away from work, which is good. But then it means, really valuing every hour in a positive way. And if you're working on something that you're passionate about, that's fine. I think it would be different if it was working on something that if it didn't give me energy. But then just, learning even when it's something you're passionate about, you can often think it's easier to put the TV on or to just scroll on social media or something like that. But reminding myself that I do enjoy those things, and sometimes it can be that little extra bit of effort to get going with something. But once I'm in the flow, it's nothing I'd rather be doing. So yeah, that piece of advice wasn't have a child and then you'll become really focused. It was more applying that mindset of, yeah, there are a lot of hours in the day, even outside of, if you've got a 9 to 5, like there's a lot of hours outside of that you can still utilize. And I've always done that, from the music blog to now what I'm doing with the podcast and No Longer Known. It's like, it's a hobby and a pastime as well. And really appreciating that there are like a good 5, 6, 7 hours that you can use every day. And yeah, just making the most of it, really.
And then I guess the mental switch as well, from work at the Environment Bank to work on No Longer Known to work on the podcast, is also a healthy thing because it keeps your brain engaged and you maintain different kinds of focus.
Yeah, and I learn things from each one that I can apply to others. And yeah, maybe eventually like I'll move No Longer Known or take off and that'll become like the full-time focus. But then I'm sure I'll have something else that'll come up. But at the moment, I learned so much from the work at Environment Bank and from No Longer that I can apply to each one. And it's hard work, and there's days where I think, yeah, this is a recipe for burnout potentially, but I'm aware of that and kind of try and manage my time and not set completely unrealistic expectations. And I think having the co-founder, having my brother on No Longer Known, he can pick up some of the slack where I don't have the time sometimes.
Yeah. And I guess, relying on each other and not setting unrealistic expectations or getting disappointed by them, realizing that maybe they're a bit ambitious, I think also helps.
Yeah.
Yeah. What is your favorite childhood memory?
I think I was reaching for something when I thought about this question, that, a kind of profound moment, whether it's like an encounter with a particular species or a bird watching trip with a relative or something. But really, when I think back to my childhood and all my memories, it's more holistic than that. It's about being outside, whether that's on vacation or playing in the garden on a summer holiday or like a long evening. So it's being in nature, but more holistically, which being outside and feeling connected to it. And yeah, as I've learnt through my career of how maybe what I thought was wild back then was actually a little bit less wild than I thought, whether it's a woodland or whatever, like actually that woodland that you were playing in was a forestry plantation and there's not much. So I've learnt, weirdly, like looking back on those memories, it's a bit bittersweet, but they're still my favorite memories because the days just felt they lasted forever. I think particularly at this time of year with the longer evenings and in the summer holidays when the sun's shining, like it just felt like those days turned into weeks sometimes. And that's one of the things where you realize as you grow a bit older is that time seems to pass that bit quicker. So I think
I noticed that.
Yeah. And thinking back to those times, they just felt like, and that's what really brought this love for the wilderness and wildness out in me. And I'm sure there are moments, if I could really rack my brain, like we mentioned the owls before, going to the owl sanctuary and going to other things. But
yes,
really it was about just being
I've planted
outside.
Thought.
Yeah, you have. I can't stop thinking about owls now.
No, that's lovely. And I think, creating that connection with nature from childhood just reinforces it the older you get. And that appreciation, I think, is incredibly important and really motivates now everything you're doing. So, thanks for sharing. What was one of the most challenging situations you've ever faced in your career to date, and how did you overcome it?
So for me, this was an interesting. I've always worked at startups because I just love the startup world and getting involved and the messiness of it and being innovative and trying to have influence even from an early age. I've always done that. But then through that, I think, you learned. I often would join a company because I really love the founder, like what they were doing and building. And that's through the podcast as well. It's like this kind of, the founder brings that passion and that the idea a lot of the time. And so I think through a couple of the businesses, the founder is left for one reason or another. And I think it's then that realization of, oh, well, do I still believe, is a mission still there? And realizing that, businesses are quite vulnerable to that change. And actually, suddenly the founder leaves, like it happened in this one previous business I was in, pretty much overnight, the whole vision and mission that you've been working on can change, and you feel like all the work you've done perhaps was undone very quickly. So I think for me, that was a bit of a challenging moment, that one in particular, because you feel like you've been working on lots of stuff and putting in all the hours and the time, and then that could be undone very quickly. So yeah, it was just, I guess, a lesson that things can change quickly, and not to put all your belief and hope in one thing, and that it's about trying to have a wider impact, and also to learn to not think back, oh, that was all wasted time, which I've learned now to think that I learned so much and so many lessons. And also very directly, how tricky it can be if you take on investment, for example, as a founder, or you have a co-founder you fall out with in that case, and everything just comes kind of crashing down, and you're like suddenly in this almost like a family situation with the divorcing parents. And that was kind of what it felt like, because it was a very small company. And yeah, those two co-founders went their separate ways, and it was really being thrown into that. So I think, yeah, that I would say was probably the most challenging moment mentally, but I learned so much from that, and I've applied that kind of thinking ever since, really. So yeah,
I guess being comfortable with change, knowing that nothing is permanent, and being flexible and seeing the silver lining that everything's a learning experience, and that you take that knowledge to the next stage of your career, or stages if you diversify, as you're definitely doing.
Yeah.
That's a great experience to reflect upon as well. And so what advice can you offer to young ecologists, environmental scientists starting out?
Yeah, so it would be that would be my advice, because I can only provide the advice that I've experienced, really. But it would be to go and work at a startup early on. I think like there was most of my friends and people I know went to work at established companies or big corporations, which brings a level of comfort and security and career path. But I think that's faded a bit, and people don't stay at companies as long as they used to. So that idea that you might go somewhere and work there for your entire career has kind of changed. So yeah, I think for me, I've loved it. And I think you learn so much, is that if you are entrepreneurial and you're wanting to learn about business, you can, rather than doing an MBA or something, which I'm sure it'd be great and provide value. But for me, just going and joining a startup and getting thrown into the deep end on stuff, like having like an environment bank. I was one of 5 or 6 members when I started, and I was immediately asked if I could go and sit in Whitehall and government to discuss biodiversity net gain with the government, and I didn't really have a choice. It was just like, okay, I suppose I'll go. And you're naive to it then, so you don't realize that you're out of your depth. You kind of just wing it, and you learn, whereas you're not protected and said, oh yeah, you can't do that until you've got 10, 20 years of experience. So for me, that's my main piece of advice to anyone that is entrepreneurial and wants to build their own thing one day, is like, just go and work at a startup. And also, if it's a startup in the environmental field, obviously, that's doing something
even better,
positive, that's even better. It doesn't necessarily need to be, because you'll still learn something, but it just feels like if that feeling that you're working on something bigger than yourself, that you're working on one of these challenges, is really motivating. And you'll learn a lot and feel connected to something kind of bigger than yourself.
Incredible. And I think, you have to jump into the deep end. I think you learn faster that way too, rather than just reading books and, writing pieces. So, oftentimes these MBA courses, I haven't taken one myself, but they faced a lot of critique nowadays. So yeah, I guess there's many ways to, how do they say it? What's quite inappropriate for a biodiverse conversation, but there's many ways to skin a cat, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I guess when I said that, so starting out in your field, that was kind of very entrepreneur specific. If it's someone that's interested in ecology or biodiversity, that's a slightly trickier one. I do still think there's loads of value in PhD and academia, because it teaches you to think in a certain way. But really, there's a lot of opportunities out there now that are paid, which is great. So loads more job opportunities that are paid a good salary at graduate level. So have a look for anything that just gets you out in the field, gets you learning. And I guess that's a thing as well with the remote working now. Like, it can be more challenging to find those opportunities where you're in an office or you're in the field doing field work. So with Ecology, you kind of have to be. So it's a good way to start, because you get out and about and you have to learn by doing rather than sat behind a desk.
So get out there and go conquer the world.
Yeah.
So, Rob, we've covered so much ground today, and we've seen the diversity and the passion that's within you. And so as we slowly wrap up the show, the key question that tries to put this all together as well is, what would you most like to be remembered for?
Oh, this is such a tricky question, because I try not to. I am aware that I don't want to be just doing things for to kind of live on beyond my time or whatever. So I try and get out of that trap to some extent, but I still do want to be remembered, of course. So I think it would be this being always try to be a little bit annoying and ask why. And thinking, why is something done the way it is? Is that just a belief we hold? Is it something that's actually easier to change with a bit of lateral thinking than maybe we think? So I would love to be remembered as someone that challenges the status quo and brings a positive spin to a positive attitude to things, of like, how do we proactively try and fix these problems, rather than someone like I used to be maybe when I was a bit younger, who would just moan and complain and think, the world's, everything's going wrong and we're never going to fix these problems. It's like, I want to be hopefully remembered as someone that brought that positive attitude and challenged people to think about these things in a slightly different way, and to bring people together from different specialisms or areas of society to think about things differently. I think, as I've talked about throughout this episode, like finding ways to connect, finding ways to tap into culture and change things. That's what I'd like to be remembered for, I think. Yeah.
Beautiful. So where can people find you if they want to get in touch?
Yes, if you want to find me, it's nolongerknown.com is if you want to learn more about what we're building there. You can find the podcast just by searching Innovate Eco. You should pop up on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. And if you just go to @RobReg, that's Rob, WREG, on most social media, that's the handle I use on LinkedIn, on Instagram, and on Twitter, even though I'm not really there anymore. So yeah, just go for Rob Reg and you'll find me.
And we'll definitely put that and links to a lot of the topics we've discussed. And the call to action, go get your t-shirt when it launches to No Longer Known in the show notes. But yeah, Rob, thank you so much for your time and for sharing your story on this episode. I really enjoyed it. And I just love the fresh take on thinking about how we can spread the message on biodiversity and conservation a lot broader than what we have been doing.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. It's been a really, really fun episode. And yeah, when I reached out to you to ask if I could come on, I think it was because I just saw so many parallels in what you're trying to do with your podcast. And I think as we've chatted, we've got a lot of things in common of how we approach these things, and just really love what you're doing and trying to having these longer form conversations as well is something that I love. And I've done various bits and bobs of media before, but it's very rare that you get to have a really long, nice, in-depth conversation like this. So I love podcasts like this. So I really appreciate you having me on and taking the time to chat to me for such a long time.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I enjoy this form too. And I find it really creates that deeper connection. And so like I do with every guest, I always give my guest the final word. So one last message for the listeners to take away from today.
Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah, I would just say to anyone listening, like in the spirit of innovation, like how can you step out of your bubble, wherever you're working, whether that's in academia or professionally, like how can you start to create more space for these conversations and tackle these problems in creative ways? So just, I don't know, a little thing for listeners there to go away and think about, like, are there different approaches they can, that may be slightly left field to them, but they can try just to really start getting a bit of momentum and testing things, because we've got nothing to lose. Like as depressing as that sounds in a way, like we're at a point now where we've got to try everything, test some things. Some things will work, some things won't, but we've got to try it, because otherwise we'll never know.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter.
And that wraps up our broad, fun, and fascinating episode with Rob Wreglesworth. For more information on endangered species, especially owls, to suggest for Rob's next t-shirt, a guide to financing ecology, or a shopping list on podcast gear, check out the show notes for more information over at petermbach.com/podcast. And as always, thank you listeners for tuning into this episode and for your feedback and support. If you are enjoying this show, I would be incredibly grateful if you could share this podcast with your family, friends, colleagues, and even fellow t-shirt enthusiasts. Subscribe or follow this podcast on Spotify, Apple Music, other podcast channels, or follow the LinkedIn group to stay up to date with the latest releases. If you're curious about me or my work in general, you can also check out my website or social media. Head to petermbach.com, my YouTube channel, Peter Marcus Bach, that's Marcus with a C, or follow me on X at Peter M. Bach or Instagram at Peter M. Bach87. Feel free to reach out to me with any feedback or guest suggestions so that I can keep improving this show. The podcast's intro and outro song is called Starsky by Alex Karen. Stay tuned for our next episode and next guest to hear how they are tackling the grand challenges.